Everybody, welcome again to Lively Minds. Glad to see you all. I think I actually know you all, so you really know the format, so that's great. So welcome as ever. Today we've got Jay Thomas, who is the West End Cluster Group's. I think you call yourself a youth worker, but you are the only person working, Jay, on it. So you're in charge. Jay obviously loves his work. He's worked for quite some time with the youth of Aberdeen and I think in Glasgow as well. So he's entitled his talk, Youth Work Stories You Couldn't Make It Up. So he's, I'm sure, going to refer to what he does with us in Aberdeen, but he'll begin, I think, by telling us about his early days in Glasgow, how he came into the youth club or working with youth really, and how he hopes to develop things. So Jay, we can't wait to hear your stories. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Alan, and I appreciate the invitation to come and share with you all. I had hoped to be able to share about the development of our work in Aberdeen, but much of our plans have obviously been on hold with the pandemic. We had a range of projects that we were about to pilot just as the pandemic hit. So we've kind of had to put a pause on that, and I've been on furlough for much of the past year. But we're kind of hopeful that things will obviously kind of return to normal following summer and begin to take forward some of those projects and plans that we had in place. But I wanted to share just some stories with you today about my time as a youth worker. This summer marks 16 years since I began working with young people on a full-time basis. And as I look back, my youthful exuberance has been replaced by lots of wrinkles, grey hair, and hopefully some wisdom and experience. While I'm not quite Victor Meldrew yet, realising that I've been doing this job for 16 years does make me feel incredibly old. There have been moments along the way that have been markers for this increasing sense of old age. The first came when younger kids would stop referring to me as that older boy when talking to their parents about me, instead describing me as that man. The second was the realisation that I've become the youth worker who has increasingly started to wear baseball caps to cover the increasing growing balding patch. And perhaps the most profound reminder came when one of the 4-year-old boys at my last church asked how old I was. I was 32 at the time. When I told him, he thought about it for a while, and he exclaimed, "My granddad's that age." Surely not, I thought to myself, but he was telling the truth. His granddad really was 32. Geez, old enough to be a granddad. It really made me think. When I was thinking about today and some of the stories and encounters I wanted to share, I realised there isn't really a common thread that unifies and ties all these stories together. They're a combination of moments that I treasure and I often think about, events and situations that have stayed with me, situations that make me smile and cry, moments I'd happily live through all over again, and times that quite literally had me tearing my hair out. My friend once described ministry, and I think it applies to youth work too, like an episode of a television sitcom. We have the privilege of guest appearing in someone else's show. Sometimes we might even be a recurring character, but for the most part, the central story doesn't really revolve around us. Life carries on, and we often fade into the background. Reflecting back on these 16 years, I feel incredibly fortunate that I get to do this as a job. And in my own small way, I've tried to pass on the same care and kindness shown to me by people in the church as I was growing up. They made the difference for me as a young person, and my hope is that I can continue to pass that on. The course for a life in youth work was set when I was just 5 years old, and my mum and I stumbled on a sign for a church holiday club. It quickly became the highlight of each and every summer. The people who gave their time to volunteer at those clubs became like family. I was the hyper kid that they prayed for every lunchtime, who was always causing bother and always getting into trouble. I had the chance to catch up recently with one of the youth leaders from those clubs, and her words were, "You were some boy, but I think you left an impression on everyone you met." Those holiday clubs were life defining for me, and without them, I really don't think I would be doing what I'm doing today. When I graduated from my first degree, I still wasn't really sure what I wanted to do job-wise. I'd started attending a new church in Glasgow, and I found myself volunteering with some of the youth groups. One particular group was called Ecclesia. It was for young people with no church connection. I was really nervous, but how hard could it be? I remember that first night being introduced to the group of young people and feeling really intimidated and out of my depth. I didn't really know what to do or say, and I was really worried about what they would think about me. Now, what I didn't know at the time was that the volunteers had been really struggling with this particular group of teenagers. There had been fights, issues with drugs and alcohol, furniture being thrown across rooms, the police were frequently called, and one volunteer was even attacked with a fire extinguisher. That first night, I agreed to lead the football. Little did I know at the time that I just landed myself the core group of troublemakers. Rather than watching from the side, though, I joined in, and we must have played non-stop for the full hour and a half. I think the other volunteers were just relieved that they had a quiet night and were able to go home with their nerves still intact. As the weeks went by, the boys would tell me of what was happening in their lives, stuff happening at home, the girls they liked, and some of the hijinks they got up to the rest of the week. They started appearing at the church at other times during the week, often just hanging about so we could continue the conversations we'd started at the youth club. As the weeks and months passed by, I really loved working with this particular group of young people. The church leadership, though, were a little bit nervous about the work with this particular group and didn't always see them hanging around as a positive. It probably wasn't helped by the time 3 of the boys went up to one of the local farms early on a Saturday morning. I still don't know how they managed it, but somehow they managed to lead a herd of cows down the hill and got them to congregate in the church car park. They'd even timed it for the church coffee morning taking place. Imagine the scene at this large church in Newton Mearns in Glasgow, as the church members turned up in their BMWs and Mercedes, only to be confronted by a car park full of farmyard animals. They weren't bad kids, they just had a lot of energy, and with most of their parents working full-time, they had a lot of time to themselves unsupervised. During that year, I decided that I would go back to college to complete a degree in youth work. Part of that involved being at another church full-time for 3 years, so it would mean having to leave this group behind that I'd really grown to love. Towards the end of my time in that particular church, we took the Ecclesia group on a weekend residential. We couldn't have found the worst place to take them, if I'm honest. I'd imagined somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, but this centre was really just a repurposed home in a very pretty and leafy village. I imagine they probably called it a village meeting when they saw the minibus arrive from Glasgow. The weekend was littered with incidents and lots of complaints from the owners of the centre and some of the local residents. For example, one of the boys for a dare had tried to run into one of the walls in the hallway. Inadvertently, he'd caused one of the light fittings to swing from the ceiling towards him. He managed to narrowly avoid it smashing over himself, and as you'd expect, the owners of the centre took us to task for what happened. We've had hundreds of groups staying with us, they said, but we've never had any experiences like this. Some of the youngsters had heard how much extra the youth club was to be charged for all the things that had been broken. We didn't know this until later, but Daniel, the boy involved, and a couple of the other boys overheard our conversations with the owners, and they decided to gather the rest of the young people together and share what they had heard. They didn't feel it was right that we took the flak for what they had done, especially when we'd done so much to support them and defend them when others were quick to attack them. Together they held a whip round for the broken light and raised £40, and they brought the money to us along with an apology for the owners. In many ways, it demonstrated just how far that particular group had come over that past year. And it was an invaluable lesson early on of trying to see the best in people and never writing anyone off, regardless of what they've done. That following summer, I took a group of teenagers from the church to lead a week of youth activities for teenagers in Dalgety Bay. The church at the time didn't have any meaningful work with teenagers and said they were keen to try and create some. We were going into the situation completely blind, so we had a rough plan of what we might do. We knew that we would need to be flexible. We spent time walking about the local area, just talking to some of the young people, trying to determine their interests about what they might like to engage with. So much of this was outside my comfort zone, As an introvert, the thought of walking up to complete strangers and initiating conversations filled me with dread. I was so nervous that the very first person I walked up to, I ended up speaking to in an English accent. I was still not quite sure what had happened and why. I was, I was like, "Hi, my name's Jay. How are you doing?" I still really didn't know why that happened or what that was about. But we opened the doors, and 35 teenagers showed up to the church that first afternoon. We ran the club twice a day. In the afternoon, the format was similar to Ecclesia in that there were a range of different activities set up in different parts of the church, and the young people could choose what they engaged with. In the evenings, we'd go to the local park and play some games outside. Numbers grew each day, and we were excited by the potential that the church had in radically developing its work with children and young people. The group of young people shared how there was little to do in the local area and that they would love to come to activities and events at the church. Ultimately, we knew that we were leaving at the end of the week and that this would be a work that we would have to pass on to others. Despite the teenagers being interested, the church didn't feel able to take it on. It was disappointing and frustrating, not because of the work that we'd put in, but by the fact that young people were keen on engaging with the church, and for whatever reason, the folks at the church didn't really feel like they could take it forward. Looking back, I can begin to understand the decision. I know how intimidating those first youth work encounters can be. However, over the years, I've also encountered lots of churches that say they want to engage with young people, when deep down they only want to do it on their own terms. After that summer, I began my 3-year degree at college in youth work and theology. It involved academic study as well as a range of placements. One of the placements I embarked on was with a youth project in Glasgow called LGBT Youth Scotland. As you can imagine, pitching the idea of working with a lesbian and gay youth group to an evangelical Bible college wasn't quite straightforward. Likewise, the youth work team at the project were skeptical too. I think they were expecting someone who was going to spend 3 months talking about sin, judgment, and hell. In my own youth group at the time, I had a number of young people questioning their sexuality and trying to make sense of who they were. I was keen to better understand the range of support that might be available to them and to see if this particular project might be something I could signpost them to. Fears allayed, we got the placement set up and I began working with 2 of the Glasgow groups in the run-up to Glasgow Pride. It was a great experience and I continued working with the project past the end of my placement. But two particular moments during that time really stand out for me. The first came as I was leading an art-based session around the question, where is God? Looking back, I cringe at my naivety, but the group engaged well with the question and the session. One particular girl's response remains etched in my mind. She drew a simple line drawing of a church and a cross, with a wall across the middle of her page. On the other side of the wall was where she stood. She explained that because of who she was and because of her sexuality, she felt cut off from church and from God. She didn't think that she'd be welcome. It was heartbreaking, and I wonder just how many other people have a similar view of church and of God. The second moment that stayed with me took place during a session in the local park. It was a beautiful summer's evening in Glasgow Green, and we'd taken one of the groups to go and play rounders. As we were playing, one of the young people, Jamie, who identified as a boy, collapsed in the park. He'd wrapped the bandages around his chest so tightly that he'd passed out. It transformed how I understood the question of sexuality and identity. So often people's sexuality is described as being a lifestyle choice, but I saw firsthand just how difficult it was for young people like Jamie to come to terms with who they were, and there was little choice involved. After graduating from college, I began the task of looking for my first full-time job. How the church responded to LGBT issues was the first thing I looked for. And in September 2009, I began working with a church in the Pollock area in Glasgow called St James's. I had an early introduction to people on a Boys Brigade residential. It felt like Ecclesia all over again, and I loved it from the very first moment. The first night, I remember going up to the bedroom about 1 o'clock and trying to get the boys to go back to sleep. As I opened the door, I was confronted by what I can only describe as a cross between the Milky Way and the Blackpool illuminations. Everything was glowing in the dark, and I literally mean everything. It transpired that the boys had snapped some glow sticks that they had brought with them. Not only had they covered every inch of the room in the liquid from the glow sticks, but also each other. Nothing quite prepares you for that moment when you open the door and you're confronted with everything shining and glowing in the dark, especially when you're trying to establish an air of authority early on. The reality, though, was they hadn't done any damage. Everything would look just as it did in a few hours' time. But I have to say, I was quite impressed with their creativity. I share that story because hopefully it gives you a sense of what the boys were like. On the way home from the trip, we stopped off at a service station about 2 hours from Glasgow. I decided to stretch my legs and I went for a wander in the shop. I should say that I can be quite impulsive at times. I'm every shop owner's dream customer. Now this day, for whatever reason, I end up buying a 4-foot cuddly toy meerkat. I proudly leave the shop with Alexander neatly tucked under my arm when it suddenly dawns on me. There's no way I can go back in this bus with this 4-foot cuddly toy. I was expecting this group of hard-to-reach boys to have a field day at my expense. I tried to think quickly to see if there was anywhere I could hide or place it for the rest of the journey. It was too big for my bag and there was no room for it at the back of the bus, so I would need to just front it out. And what happened next I could never have planned for. Rather than facing a barrage of jokes and comments, the boys from one of the poorest communities in Scotland spent the next 2 hours taking turns of cuddling into the toy meerkat. The rest of the journey spent in complete silence on our way back to Glasgow. I can't know for sure, but I wonder if we accidentally created a moment and a safe space where the boys could be kids again. In communities like Pollock and Glasgow, young people are often forced to grow up far too quickly. So for my first couple of weeks in post, I was feeling like a pretty good youth worker. That was until all the boys fell out with me a month later after they heard that I'd given Alexander away to my local charity shop. Now, it would only be fair if I balanced that story out with an occasion when I felt like the world's worst youth worker. Working with local schools has always been a large feature and element of my work. At one particular high school, I ran a nurture group called Hot Chocolate. In a large and very overcrowded school, its aim was to create a safe space for pupils to go at lunchtime to make friends, play some games, and of course, drink some hot chocolate. On this particular Wednesday, I was feeling really stressed, with lots on my mind and lots of work still to be completed for the weekend. I'm carrying 2 large urns of hot water, my rucksack, and about 50 cups of hot chocolate. That's when this kid bangs into me in the school corridor, and I swear he's done it on purpose. And I'm not proud to say that I began shouting at him. He gave as good as he got though, and we have this back and forth argument in the corridor that lasted for about 10 minutes, none of which was particularly edifying. The bell rings for lunchtime and we go our separate ways. I'm annoyed and frustrated, but I know I shouldn't have shouted at him. I try to forget about it so I can be as present as possible with the lunchtime group. I wore lots of different hats in that particular school, and following the lunchtime club, I spent some time in the supported learning department, leading group work sessions and working one-to-one with pupils needing a little bit of extra support. The head of the department explains this day that I'm going to be working with a new pupil called Andrew, and that she'll go to get him from his class. So 5 minutes later, Andrew walks through the door, and I realise it's the same kid I've just had this shouting match with a bit earlier. As the teacher introduces me, he looks up from staring at his shoes, realises who I am at the exact same moment as I recognise him, and we both burst out laughing. Laughing, we explain to the teacher that we've already met, although we don't go into the full circumstances, and we begin working together. In a funny way, the argument had actually broken the ice between us, and for whatever reason, it allowed us to build rapport very quickly. He'd been moved from 3 or 4 different schools already, and I could see that he didn't trust people easily. I grew very fond of Andrew, and I like to think that we had some good conversations in the time that we worked together with one another. However, about 2 months later, he was moved to another school again. Over the years, I've worked in some very challenging areas. Most of the time, I've never felt unsafe, but there was one occasion when I was beaten up. Before you start to worry too much, it was by a 5-year-old girl. It's one of those moments where I have no idea why it happened. A new family started coming along to our Sunday club, Reagan and Raina. They were great kids, but no matter how hard I tried tried, Raina would never speak. She was really well behaved and always did what she asked. And on the odd occasion she'd say a word or two, it would be a very gentle whisper. 6 months had passed and she never really said anything. Then one day we were having a superheroes themed party. Really, it was just an excuse for me to wear my Superman costume. But as Raina arrived that afternoon, she made a beeline for me and started punching the suit. This caused a couple of other kids to join her in her endeavour. It makes me smile thinking that this gentle kid, who barely said anything for 6 months, was the cause of this mini riot. I could have understood if it was a character who was a bad guy or a villain, but who wants to beat up Superman? If it was me that she didn't like, she would probably have beat me up months earlier, so I have no idea what made her do it. She came out of her shell soon after that. She's just had her primary school graduation and starts secondary school after summer. Another reason to feel incredibly old. So to give you a break from me speaking, I wanted to show you just a short video of a song that we recorded with some of the children at St James's in Pollock. There are so many reasons why this video remains special to me, but when I think about the day that it was filmed, I'm reminded of how comfortable both the children and parents were in and around the church. When I first arrived at St James's in Pollock, parents were so reluctant to even come through the doors with their kids. And so for me, this video represents 7 or 8 years of good youth work. So I'll just give me a few seconds just to find the video, and hopefully I can share that with you. Okay. Okay. Should be able to share it in just a second. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
From the breaking of the daylight, have you seen the world with your eyes? Finding beauty in the broken, trusting promises you've spoken. God bless you, give us a future and a hope. We are not forgotten, we are not alone. Plans to lead us home into your heart. You are always with us everywhere we are. You stay loyal for a lifetime, through the shadows and the sunrise. When our worries overtake us, we believe that they will break us. God bless you, give us a future and a hope. We are not forgotten, we are not alone. Plans to lead us home into your heart. You are always with us everywhere we are. So long, your love will never stop. Shining down upon us, never letting out. On your love will see us through. Even in the shadows, we will trust in you. God bless you, give us a future and a hope. We are not forgotten, we are not alone. Plans to lead us home into your heart. You are always with us everywhere we are. Plans to give us a future and a hope. We are not forgotten, we are not alone. Plans to lead us home into your heart.
So that was a time from we used to run some holiday clubs in October and at Easter time, and we thought we'd do something different at one of them, and so we brought in a voice coach to work with some of the kids, and so they recorded the song together over the course of the week, and then we filmed it together on the last day. And most of those kids in the video weren't kids that came along to church or necessarily had any church connections, and so it's always quite difficult when you're trying to introduce worship songs about what you're asking them to say or kind of assent to. But it just fills me with so much happiness watching that back, and again, seeing just how comfortable they were in and around the church space. But also quite frightening knowing that how much older they all are now as well, and how Raina, the girl who beat me up in the Superman costume, was in the video as well. Like butter wouldn't melt. But yeah, so just those encouraging those kids to be in and around the building. And as I say, it was quite a big development, because when I first came to the church, parents were literally scared to cross the threshold of the church. They would bring their kids to some things, but they would never ever venture into the building. And one of the last events that we held, we realized kind of as we were developing the work that we wanted to not just work with children, but we wanted to work with families as well. Because I think sometimes we kind of segregate by age. But we started creating events for children and families. And one of the last events that I was able to run while being at the church, we were making some bottle rockets at the back of the church outside in the grass. And we were due to finish maybe about 12:30, but it was one of those days that everyone was just so enjoying what they were doing. They didn't care about what time it was, and we just stayed and we enjoyed being together. And again, just it marked how far that we'd come over the 7 or 8 years that I'd been there. I know that we're going to have time for questions a little bit later, so maybe if you have any questions, particularly about our work in Aberdeen, that might be the best time to chat about it. But I wanted to finish with one final story. It's more of a parable though. It's maybe quite reflective of some of the experiences I've had in my time as a youth worker. So I share it with you. In a land far, far away, there lived 2 youth workers. They couldn't be any more different from one another, and they had different levels of success. The first got his first job working for a church. He was idealistic and keen to impress. He didn't want anyone to think he was out of his depth, and so he did everything to please his new employer. He'd faithfully attend the monthly Kirk session meetings and share his latest ideas. The elders smiled and the minister nodded his head in approval. "Let us know next month how you got on," they said. And so as the months and years rolled by, our first youth worker made great strides in the local community. New groups emerged, new projects took shape, and new families joined the church. It was like he had the Midas touch. Everything he started was such a great success. Everyone spoke about how great the youth worker was. Kids flocked to the groups and the adults were happy because the church was full. It's just like the old days, they'd say. But the youth worker noticed the more successful he was, the more those who had volunteered would step back. He was doing everything, but the people seemed happy. The parents loved how he was with the kids, and the church members were ecstatic that the church was so busy. And so he carried on, tired, but happy that people thought he was a big success. But there came a time when he decided to move on to pastures new and to seek out a fresh challenge. Those in the church said to themselves, "We'll never find a youth worker quite like him." And as the years went by, the groups that were once so popular and successful started to die off until there was nothing left. If only we had our old youth worker, the church members said to themselves. He'd know what to do. The second youth worker had a different approach. She seemed so unsure about what she was meant to be doing. She spent more time talking to the old people in the church than she did with children and young people. In an attempt to be helpful, the elders and the ministers would suggest ideas and projects for her to start. They had really expected more when they had taken her on. She had come highly recommended. She seemed to concentrate her time in drinking coffee and chatting with the over 65s. Definitely not what the church had expected when they employed a youth worker. Hours she'd spend inquiring about people's interests and passions. He'd encourage them to share their talents and gifts. Well, we can't do that. They'd say, we're far too old and we have nothing to offer. Or they'd say, I used to be involved, but I took a step back. The minister was really starting to tear his hair out. After 39 years of ministry, he was mostly bald anyway. Why can't she be the way with the children and young people? Why can't she be this way with the children and young people, he thought to himself. So as the months went by, no new youth groups or projects with young people emerged. It seemed to the minister nothing had changed from the first day that she was hired, but he did recognise that she'd built up good relationships with many of the older people within the church. Aware of some of the groans in the background, the youth worker decided it was time for her to move on. She hadn't made as much progress as she would have liked, and the youth group still had the same 2 members that were there before she'd started. The minister agreed that maybe it was best that they parted ways. The youth work experiment was deemed to be a failure, and most of the church resigned themselves to being the next church earmarked for closure, or even worse, a union. Unwilling to give up so easily, 2 of the over 65s in the church decided to start a craft group. If no one else is going to do anything, then maybe we should, they reasoned. If nothing else, at least we'll be doing something we enjoy. And so they opened the doors, and only one young person came. He loved the attention he got from the older ladies. They reminded him of his gran, and he enjoyed getting to make lots of different things. The next week, he came back with some friends, and slowly but surely the group grew. Gaining confidence from the success of the craft group, some of the people within the church began to think of many more ways they could use what they were passionate about to reach others. One of the elders who enjoyed hiking and the outdoors decided to try setting up a walking group. Another, who was a former teacher, not long retired, decided she could spend an hour a week mentoring a pupil at the local high school. A small group of the ladies wondered if young people would be interested in baking, and so they made plans. On the first week, they made a Victoria sponge, and the following week, they worked on making a cheesecake. It was a huge success, and the young people decided they could help a local charity by making and selling some cakes. And so the group continued and grew. Before the church knew it, its work with children and young people was thriving, and they became famous across the country, and people would visit from other congregations to learn what their secret formula was. As a group of over 65s reflected on just how far they'd come as a church in their work with children and young people, they all said the same thing. The youth worker was right. We could do it. Thanks very much.
Jay, thank you very much for that. Folks, have you any questions you want to ask Jay?
Anne.
Yes, Anne, on you go.
Jay, could you tell us something of how you've been finding working with these our group of churches in Aberdeen, please?
Sure. So I came into post October 2018, I think. And so I spent the first period of time doing some research. Again, a bit like the situation in Dalgety Bay, trying to get a sense of what young people would like to engage with. And we had a good sense of that, and had gone into last year with a plan of 4 pilot projects that we're about to launch in response to what young people had told us. But it coincided just as the pandemic hit. So our first project that we were going to launch was exam support group based at Queen's Cross Cafe at Queen's Cross, to create a space for young people to study for their exams alongside their friends in a much more social type of environment, a much more relaxed type of environment, and that we would provide tutors to support that. As I say, that was going to run begin in March of last year, just as the pandemic hit. And we had hoped initially that we might be able to move that online as well. But then obviously exams were cancelled that year and again this year. So much of my work has probably changed since the pandemic. My work before was really geared towards trying to find ways of connecting with young people that have no church connection. So, you know, led kind of various projects, leadership programs at the primary schools. We led a participatory budgeting project with some of the pupils at Mile End, as well as transition work with pupils ahead of their move to high school and things like that. But as the pandemic obviously hit, my focus has been in supporting the young people already connected with our congregations, and trying to create, I guess, times and spaces within the past 14-15 months that were that took place at the same time and that were predictable, when so much of everything else was changing in constant flux. To have a kind of a period where we could spend some time together, and it's probably some of the best youth work I've been able to do over the past 14-15 months. With one particular group in mind, we've got to a place where we're able to share honestly with one another what we find difficult, and it's been great seeing the young people grow in confidence through that. A big part of that is about encouraging them to take the lead at different times. And so it wasn't just youth workers or volunteers leading sessions, but the young people themselves coming up with the activities that we would take part in. Another part of the work, particularly that's been really great for bringing the congregations, some of the volunteers involved from the congregations a bit closer together, has been our virtual Sunday club. So when many churches obviously were meeting in person, we tried to create some online resources, materials for children and families. Videos would be recorded each week with a story and different activities for parents and their kids, and that was led by people from Holborn West, from Midstock, from Queen's Cross, and Ruby's Law as well. So across the 4 churches, and so it was really a great opportunity to begin that work together. And so I guess the challenge is as things start to return to how they were before the pandemic, what opportunities might exist for some of that work, joint work, to continue going forward. And the hope is that that some of the pilot projects that we had lined up are things that we can take forward once kind of the restrictions ease and life looks a bit more normal than it does at the moment. So I hope that kind of gives you a sense, Anne, of some of the work that we've been doing together with the various churches.
I'd just like to say, I think I shall be very wary if you come to speak to me.
Yes. I think Moira had raised her hand.
It's me. It's Ron here, Jay.
Hi.
All your early years were dealing with really underprivileged kids and places with what you would imagine to be totally different needs to the people in the West End of Aberdeen. What made you decide that you wanted the challenge of that difference, and how has it been as you expected, the different needs of our kids?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I had a kind of deep sense that Aberdeen would be the next stop in my kind of youth work journey, probably 2015, 2016. And at that point, I had a conversation with Scott, because I think that probably coincided just as you were all beginning to start the conversation together as a grouping about maybe doing some joint with youth work. So it's hard to explain. I felt really deeply that Aberdeen would be the next stop, and there was lots of coincidences and little nudges on the way that made me feel like it was the right thing to do at that particular moment. But you're so right. It's a very different experience in the West End of Aberdeen compared to some of the other experiences that I've had before. The thing that strikes me about young people in Aberdeen is just the amount of pressure and stress that they're under. Obviously, pressure to do well at school, but even with some of the, we find during the research that young people, on average, were taking part in 3 or 4 extracurricular clubs a week, and especially when you start to think about parents, if they have more than two kids, just how much work that involves getting young people from place to place. And so not only are young people themselves stressed, but there's a lot of pressure on families as well. And when we started to kind of tease out what some of those clubs and groups were, there was lots of pressure that came with the extracurricular activities that young people were involved in that increased their stress levels even more. So lots of the activities that they were taking part in either revolved around competition or certification. And so what I kind of heard early on was that there was no real opportunity in space for young people just to be themselves without the pressure of having to perform or compete or study. And so that's why we tried to, a lot of our pilot projects were focused around trying to create safe space where young people could just be themselves, free from some of that pressure. So I think that's probably the biggest need that we encountered. Young people said themselves, we led a number of focus groups during our research stage, and young people articulated quite clearly that that's what they were looking for and would engage in. But a couple of young people said, we need a bit of hope as well. And so I think we underestimate just how much pressure and stress our young people face. You know, they would often talk about their teachers not knowing how much work their other teachers at school had already given them, and so they felt overworked. I mean, the other thing I would see as well is that obviously within Aberdeen, you know, and this is reflected at the grammar school as well. You know, poverty is still very much an issue in some parts of Aberdeen, and so some of the experiences I had before have been good in informing the types of work and approaches that I kind of adopted and supporting some of the pupils moving up to the grammar as well. You know, one example of that was the transition work that we did ahead of the year just before the pandemic hit. You know, one of the boys, a bit like Raina, you know, the girl in the story who beats up Superman, he came to our sessions, and they were like 6 weeks we ran the groups for, and he came to the session and he didn't say anything for the entire time, and you're trying your best to try to tease something out of him, but nothing. And we were walking along the corridor at the grammar school one day, and I was just trying to fill time more than anything, fill the vacuum of noise more than anything. And so I just started clicking my fingers as I'm walking along the corridor, and I see his face light up, and he shouts at me the name of a character from a film called Thanos, who clicks his fingers. And this is like week 5 of the program, and something just by sheer accident that we stumble upon is what enables them to open up and just become so much more animated than we've ever seen them. So the reason I share that is because, you know, sometimes we have no idea what young people are facing at home, and so I think sometimes we can assume that, you know, everybody's like kind of fairly affluent in Aberdeen, but the reality is that lots of young people are facing the same types of environments that some of the kids I worked with before were facing as well. So, but it's funny, you find yourself stumbling into these moments, and it's not like you plan or deliberately do something, but just sheer coincidence that connected with them for whatever reason.
Do you find the stress levels just as bad at primary school age as I can understand the secondary schools because I've witnessed it, but primary schools as well?
I mean, it's probably slightly less, but I think there's still a pressure on children and young people to know as early as possible what job they want to do, and particularly if you've got brothers and sisters, you know, is that inevitable comparing and, you know, comparison that takes place, you know, with how your brother or sisters performed at school, and so I think families themselves feel lots of pressure. I think that spreads out to kids of all ages.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, on you go, Carol.
Sorry, I was pressing that. Do you find over the years that you have been working with the youth that the problems are continuous with the different kind of generations, so to speak? You know, the problems of when you started and the perhaps difficulties or the nice things that happen kind of when you started, are they just the same now that you're a few years on, or has everything changed as society changes, or our perception of society changes?
It's a really good question. Thanks, Carol. We were talking just before we kind of came on to Zoom about for a long time youth work was seen as kind of a remedy for problem behaviour. And I think sometimes when you start, when that's your starting place, it's not a very helpful. It's not a very helpful thing to have at the back of your mind as a reason for being involved with young people. I would say that things have changed over the years. This is something I've been spent quite a lot of time kind of looking at, the kind of trends and behaviours of what's called Generation Z. That's kind of young people born after 1995, and kind of studies find that young people are less likely to smoke, to drink, and to take drugs. And so the research is saying that young people in Generation Z are probably much more like that post-war generation. So there's a kind of natural affinity between young people and older people, but also how passionate young people are about trying to create change in the world and in their communities. You know, we all know just how passionate young people are about things, you know, issues like the environment, as an example. So, you know, I'm greatly encouraged that not only are young people choosing much more positive behaviours, but also that they see that they can create and they can create and be agents of positive change in their community and around the world. So I'm greatly encouraged by that. I mean, obviously, there will always be exceptions to the rule, and I think what I've tried to do in my time as a youth worker is not necessarily to judge behaviour, you know, but to be someone who's a consistent presence in the life of young people. So when young people themselves realise that they want to make a change in their own life, that they have someone who can that can walk alongside them and be with. So I think sometimes if we just spend our life kind of wagging the finger, that's really not going to help anybody, because young people already have people who do that. So I think if you want to be if you want to play a significant role in someone's life, it's I guess it's been there consistently for them. So.
Yeah, back to you, Anne.
Thinking of what you were saying, or your parable about the different styles of youth workers in churches, in your activities that you were able to organise before COVID, have members of the group churches been involved in helping you?
To a large extent, the first part of work in Aberdeen was more of a kind of scouting mission, if I'm honest. For me personally, to kind of go out and see where the opportunities existed. And once we'd kind of determined that, to kind of come back to the churches and say, this is what we've realised, this is what I find, who can help me with this? And I suppose as we were about to launch those pilot projects, you know, the supporting young people in their studies, a good example. There's lots of former teachers in our congregations, and so at that point, that would have been where I would be asking for support and help to assist with some of those groups. And obviously over the past 14, 15 months, those who'd, I suppose, already been involved in leading aspects of youth and children's work at the various churches came together to work like that. But I think in my experience, lots of people in churches find it much easier working with the younger age group, primary school age. But for whatever reason, as soon as they hit 12 or 13, we start to get a little bit more nervous about whether we're able to, volunteers feel a little bit more nervous, I think, about whether they'll be able to work with that group well enough, or whether they have the skills to do that. So I guess that's part of the reason why I shared my kind of own sense of intimidation and vulnerability at starting, because I think we will all feel that. but I think that young people probably naturally gravitate to the oldest person in the room. So I think whatever age we are, I think there's definitely something that we can offer to our collective churches work with children and young people. So.
I have one last question. I'm involved with the eco group at Queen's Cross. Do you sense any concern for climate change and eco things with the young people that you engage with?
Definitely, it was something that came up when I was leading our. I led a session with some of the primary schools around the question, what makes a good community, and you know, the issue of the environment and care for the environment came back so strongly from those groups. We're talking like primary 6 and primary 7, where they have very clear opinions and beliefs about that. So definitely, I think it's something that I think there's an opportunity there. But how we connect groups like the eco group at Queen's Cross with maybe schools or particular classes that might be working on a particular subject like climate change. But definitely.
Thank you.
Yes, I don't know your name, but carry on. You're still actually muted.
Unmute, got it.
Great.
Sorry, can I be very cheeky? I'm interested, how are you funded?
Sure, it's a really good, timely question, actually. So my post is part funded by Aberdeen Presbytery and the Central Church in Edinburgh. But in terms of kind of working budget for the projects that we're kind of leading and involved in, each of the congregations across the partnership contribute a kind of a sum of money each year to the work of the youth and children's work, and so we've not really delved into that too much over the past number of years. I think money's obviously important and good to have and good to be able to use, but at the same time, I think sometimes, because I've maybe worked in settings where, when I was at St James's, my budget for the year was £100, and I managed to run about 6 or 7 different events and programs off of that. So I think it was a really good discipline to have early on in my kind of youth work journey, to be creative and to, you can come up with some really good activities that doesn't, that don't cost a lot, but at the same time, it's nice having a slightly larger budget in Aberdeen.
So are you appointed then by the Church of Scotland?
Yes.
Mainly.
So
yes.
Yeah. So my kind of across Scotland, there is about 110, 120 members of staff that are called MDS workers, Ministry Development Staff. So they could be youth workers, assistant ministers, family workers. That there's a broad range of what those roles do. I guess the question going forward is the presbytery plan is suspended, and the numbers are being looked at again. Is just how many MDS staff might be left after that process is completed. So,
thank you.
Now, I think, Jay, that's all the questions I think we have. It's been a terrific talk.
Thank you.
Never write anyone off stands in my mind among many things that you've said. And that really just tells us that we've definitely got the right person in post to do the job. So thank you very much. One thing you said relates to my own experience regarding age. The children I teach very rarely ask how old I am. And on the 2 occasions that has happened, the response has been the same. He said, not even my grandmama is that old. So It certainly isn't an issue with young people, I don't think. But what a wonderful talk, and you do so much for us. That's just wonderful. I think it'd be mad not to keep the funding going, to keep you going and the work that you do. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Good to see everyone as well.
Thank you. The future is great as well, because on the 20th, I say check that, that's the 20th of July, we stay with the local theme, and we're hearing from Sophie Green, the CEO of Instant Neighbour, an organisation we know very well from Aberdeen, who do fantastic work. So that's in 2 weeks' time. I'm also looking ahead to the 9th of August. I think that's the date that the Scottish Government are going to decide what the future regarding COVID-19 is going to be regarding restrictions. So I'm hoping that's going to be hopefully positive news, and hopefully again, not too far in the future, we can go back to meeting face to face, but obviously more of that later on. So for today, wonderful to see you. Thanks again, Jay. See you all again in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Thank you.
Ooh.
Just to say a quick thank you, Alan, for organising, and for the folks who are doing all the technical stuff in the background as well. So thank you.
No, pleasure, Jay. Thanks.
Take care.